There is a specific kind of enemy that no fortress wall was built to stop. Not the alien, not the unknown, not the thing that arrives from outside the light, the thing that helped build the wall. The Chaos Space Marines were the Imperium's greatest sons. They carried its banners across the galaxy for 2 centuries. They bled for it, built it, gave everything they had to a civilization that would not exist without them. And then they turned around. What follows is the story of why, and what 10,000 years of living with that choice looks like. The Chaos Space Marines are the most dangerous enemies the Imperium of man has ever faced. Not because they are the most numerous. The Tyranids exceed them in numbers by magnitudes. Not because they are the most alien. The Necrons predate humanity itself. But because they were once the Imperium's greatest protectors. They were built from the same template, trained in the same traditions, sworn to the same emperor. They understand every fortification the Imperium builds, every tactical doctrine its warriors follow, every vulnerability in the civilization they spent centuries helping to construct. They know where everything is, because they helped build it. The Chaos Space Marines are Space Marines who fell. Tonight we go into who they were before the falling, and into the specific forces that made the falling possible. The Space Marine Legions. Before the Horus Heresy, before the Chaos, Space Marines existed as a category. There were 20 Space Marine Legions. Each was a military formation of transhuman warriors, men whose bodies had been rebuilt through gene seed implantation to exceed ordinary human capability in every measurable way. Stronger, faster, more resilient, capable of surviving environments that would kill unaugmented humans, capable of fighting for days without rest, of processing battlefield information faster than any unenhanced soldier, of forming bonds of loyalty and brotherhood that centuries of shared combat produced, and that the gene seed's psychological conditioning deepened. Each legion numbered in the tens of thousands. Each bore the genetic material of one of the 20 Primarchs, the Emperor's sons, the template from which the legions were created. Each had its own character, shaped by the Primarch who led it, and the worlds that fed it recruits. Together, they conducted the Great Crusade, 200 years of military expansion that brought the fragmented human worlds under a single banner, that ended the isolation of the Age of Strife, that gave humanity a civilization that spanned the galaxy rather than a collection of struggling remnants. The legions were the sword of this project, brutally effective, incalculably expensive to produce, absolutely devoted in the years before the heresy to the Emperor's vision. What the heresy did to this edifice was not simply military, it was personal. These were beings who had fought beside each other for centuries, who had shared campaigns and grief and the specific bond that comes from surviving things that should have killed you. When 9 of the 20 legions raised their weapons against the other 9, the betrayal was not abstract political treachery. It was brothers killing brothers, on a scale that dwarfed any previous human conflict. What each legion had been. The word-bearers had been the most theologically devoted of the legions, the ones who built temples on every world they conquered, who worshipped the Emperor as a divine figure, who organized their existence around the specific hunger for something sacred. When the Emperor told them their devotion was wrong, they found the Chaos Gods instead, their specific tragedy. They were not wrong that something divine existed in the universe. They were wrong about which divinity was worth serving. The Night Lords had been the enforcers. Conrad Kurz's legion that used terror as its primary tactical instrument, that hung the bodies of criminals and enemies as warnings, that moved through darkness and used psychological breakdown as deliberately as other legions used firepower. they had always been dark. What the heresy did was remove the specific constraint of imperial law that had kept the darkness directed toward imperial ends, rather than simply toward whatever direction provided the most fear. The Iron Warriors had been the siege masters, the Legion given the hardest assignments, the fortresses no one else could crack, the planetary assaults that would grind other legions to nothing, the grinding attritional campaigns that Perturabo's specific military genius excelled at. They had been given the thankless work and watched other legions receive the glory. The resentment was real, and it had years to accumulate. The Alpha Legion had been the most mysterious even before the heresy. Alpharius and Omegon's twin-commanded legion that specialized in infiltration, misdirection, deception, that planted agents years before campaigns began, that won battles through confusion rather than overwhelming force. What they were in the heresy and what they are afterward is, characteristically, not clearly defined. The World Eaters had been warriors whose specific capacity for violence exceeded what the Great Crusade required and what human psychology could contain without assistance. The Butcher's nails, the cortical implants that had been pressed into Angron's skull before the Emperor found him, that had then been pressed into the skulls of his warriors, had transformed them into something that required violence the way other beings require food. By the time the heresy came, they were already partly what the heresy made them. Khorne found them almost pre-converted. The Death Guard had been endurance made into military doctrine. Mortarian's legion that advanced through anything. Plague clouds, chemical weapons, environments that would kill other legions. Through the specific refusal to stop that the Death Guard had made their identity. They marched. They held. They did not stop. What Nurgle found in them was a capacity for persisting through dissolution that was exactly what his gift of plague and decay required. The Emperor's children had been the pursuit of perfection. Fulgrim's legion that sought mastery in everything. The finest warriors, the finest artists, the finest musicians, the finest surgeons. The excellence that the Legion had organized itself around made them vulnerable to Slaanesh in the specific way that any pursuit taken to its limit becomes indistinguishable from the excess that the Prince of Chaos embodies. The Thousand Sons had been the scholars. Magnus, the Red's Legion, whose relationship to psychic power and arcane knowledge made them the most intellectually sophisticated of the legions and the most dangerous in ways that ordinary military assessment could not capture. When the heresy came for them, it came through a prophecy delivered against the Emperor's explicit orders and a punishment so disproportionate to the violation that it destroyed whatever loyalty remained. The Sons of Horus were simply the best, the War Master's own legion, the finest all-around fighting force of the Great Crusade, the one whose Primarch had been named Supreme Commander of all the Imperium's forces. When Horus fell, they fell with him, because if Horus believed the Emperor had betrayed everything they had built, what argument could a Space Marine make against that belief when the Space Marine's entire life had been organized around the War Master's judgment? The corruption that found each legion. The Chaos Gods are not indifferent to the Legion's specific qualities. They are not simply powerful entities who corrupted Space Marines through generic spiritual contamination. They are, in the specific sense of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, beings who are shaped by mortal desire and emotion and who specialize in finding the exact form of corruption that a specific being is most susceptible to. Khorne found warriors who valued strength and combat above everything. The World Eaters were the most complete conversion, but elements of every legion that prized martial excellence could be drawn toward the Blood God's straightforward bargain: kill and be empowered. Nurgle found those who feared loss and dissolution, who wanted to preserve what they had, who dreaded the ending of things, who could be offered immortality of a kind that never required the uncomfortable pretense that what was being preserved was still alive in the conventional sense. Tzeentch found those who sought knowledge and change, and the next thing beyond what was currently understood, the Thousand Suns, were the purest expression of this, but any intellectual hunger could be turned toward the architect of fate's specific domain. Slaanesh found those who pursued any pleasure or excellence to its extreme. The Emperor's children were the most direct case, but the Prince of Excess has room for anyone who wants more of what they currently have in a way that ordinary satisfaction cannot provide. And Chaos Undivided, the worship of all four, the specific allegiance that the Black Legion would eventually make their identity, found those who wanted power itself, rather than the specific gifts of any single patron. Why they are still fighting. 10,000 years. The Horus Heresy ended in the early 31st millennium. The settings present is the 41st millennium. The same warriors who fought at the Siege of Terror, who stood in the ruins of Istvan V, who betrayed brothers they had served beside for centuries. Many of them are still alive, still fighting. The Eye of Terror, where the Traitor Legions fled after the Heresy's defeat, does not process time the way real space does. The warp's relationship to linear sequence is unreliable at the best of times. Inside the Eye, where the boundary between the material universe and the Imperium is at its thinnest, time moves in ways that do not map onto the calendar that the Imperium maintains. A warrior who has spent time in the Eye may have experienced a century, while the galaxy outside has aged a millennium. Or he may have experienced 10,000 years of subjective time, while only a decade passed outside. The Chaos Gods also sustain those who serve them with a specific form of immortality that is not quite undeath and not quite natural life. The driven, the hateful, the specifically useful. These are preserved by the ruinous powers in forms that continue to function past the point where ordinary biology would have given out. Ezekal Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus, the man who reorganized the Shattered Legion and named it the Black Legion, has been leading campaigns against the Imperium for 10,000 years. The same Abaddon, not a successor bearing the name, the original, sustained by the Chaos God's specific interest in having someone capable of temporarily unifying the Traitor Legions alive and motivated. The Long War is not a metaphor. It is the same war, fought by some of the same warriors, against a civilization that has changed around them in 10,000 years in ways they mostly decline to account for. The first wound, before following the Traitor Legions into the Eye of Terror and across 10,000 years of the Long War, it is worth sitting for a moment with what the heresy cost the people who conducted it. The Loyalists lost brothers, and knew they were losing them, in real time, at Istvan and at the siege. The specific grief of watching someone you served beside for centuries become someone pointing a weapon at you is documented throughout the heresy's novels and the setting's background material. The traitors also lost brothers, the World Eater's warriors who died at Istvan III, the loyalist elements that were virus-bombed by their own Primarch's decision, were killed by people who had grown up alongside them. The Raven Guard and Salamanders and Iron Hands, who were massacred at Istvan V, were killed by legions that had campaigned with them for decades. Nobody who fought in the heresy was unchanged by it. The specific wound that the Long War is prosecuted from, the hatred that sustains Abaddon across 10,000 years, the bitterness that makes individual Chaos Marines fight with the intensity of personal grievance, rather than simple ideology, is the wound of the heresy itself, of what was possible before it and what could not be recovered after. They lost the Great Crusade, not simply as a military enterprise, as a vision of what humanity could become, a united species, rebuilding civilization across the stars, governed by the greatest human who ever lived. That is gone. The Emperor is on the golden throne. The Imperium is not what it was meant to be. And the people who destroyed the possibility of what it was meant to be have spent 10,000 years living with what they did. The Chaos Gods sustain the long war. The specific fuel that sustains it in each individual warrior is the knowledge of what was lost, and the specific psychological work of deciding that it was worth losing, that it had to be lost, that whoever or whatever is responsible for the loss, it was not them. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the Eye of Terror is waiting. The Siege of Terror ended. Horus was destroyed. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, and the 9 Traitor Legions, reduced, broken, hunted by loyalist forces who had every reason for vengeance and no shortage of capability for it, fled. The campaign that followed the heresy's end is called the Great Scouring. The Imperium drove the Traitor Legions toward the Eye of Terror with the specific ferocity of an institution that had just survived its own near destruction and was now expressing the accumulated grief of that survival through military action. Worlds that had sided with Horus were purged. Populations were reduced. The evidence of the heresy's civilian collaboration was addressed with the Imperium's characteristic efficiency. The Traitor Legions ran, not in disorder. Some of them maintained sufficient cohesion to conduct rearguard actions, to cover the retreat of their slower elements, to deny the loyalists the complete annihilation they were attempting. But they ran into the Eye. What the Eye is. The Eye of Terror is the largest permanent warp intrusion in the galaxy, the specific location where the boundary between real space and the immaterium is at its absolute thinnest, where the 2 dimensions bleed into each other continuously, rather than at the specific stress points that warp storms and Geller field failures create elsewhere. It was Perturabo who named it, the Iron Warrior's Primarch, whose entire existence had been haunted by the anomaly visible from worlds he had conquered, who had looked at the vast region of churning, corrupted space and given it the name that both sides of the heresy would eventually adopt, the Eye of Terror. Inside the Eye, the physics of real space operate unreliably. Matter can be reshaped by the warp energies that saturate it. Time moves at its own pace, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes in ways that make pace a meaningless concept. Demons do not require the specific rituals that summon them in real space. They exist in the Eye as a matter of course, the natural inhabitants of a space that partakes of the immaterium, as much as of the material universe. Planets inside the Eye are called demon worlds. They are not simply inhabited by chaos forces, they are shaped by chaos forces, their physical properties reflecting the will and nature of whatever divine patron has claimed them, or whatever powerful enough mortal force has imposed its vision on the pliable reality. Daemon worlds can look like anything. Some look beautiful, some look like nightmare, some look like what they were before, imperial worlds, elder maiden worlds, alien civilizations, preserved in the specific amber of warp saturation. The original form maintained while the nature of everything within it has changed. The Traitor Legions made this their home. They had no choice. The Imperium controlled every other location they could have retreated to. and the specific pursuit of the Great Scouring was thorough enough that no loyalist-controlled region was safe. The Eye was the one place where the Imperium would not follow in force. Could not follow in force, because sending a significant military expedition into the Eye of Terror was a commitment that would cost more than it returned. Entering the Eye. The 9 legions arrived at the Eye in different states. The Death Guard were already transformed. Nurgle's mark on them was complete. Their bodies remade. Their relationship to decay and disease settled into what it would remain for 10,000 years. The Thousand Suns had already been broken at Prospero. Their non-psychic warriors reduced to rubric marines by Ahriman's catastrophic mercy spell. Their Primarch, a demon prince. The World Eaters were in the specific condition that the Butcher's nails and the escalating violence of the heresy had produced. Less a legion than a collection of individual berserkers who happened to share gene seed and a blood-coloured aesthetic. The Emperor's children had the specific problem of having accelerated their transformation so completely during the heresy's final phases that what they carried into the Eye was not simply a corrupted legion, but an engine of excess that could not stop. Every sensation had been modified to produce pleasure rather than pain. The search for new sensations, the specific hunger of a being whose threshold for ordinary experience had been raised so high by extraordinary overindulgence that only increasingly extreme inputs registered, was already driving them when the Eye's gates closed behind them. They brought slaves, the people of terror and the worlds they had passed through, captured specifically for the use they would provide in the Eye's first years. The Emperor's children went through these slaves faster than their own moral economy could sustain, and then began looking at the other Legion's slave populations. This is how the Legion Wars started, not with ideology, with the Emperor's children running out of people to hurt and finding the solution in proximity to everyone else's people. The Slave Wars, the Legion Wars, called also the Slave Wars, are the specific period of fratricidal violence among the Traitor Legions in the Eye of Terror that followed the Great Scouring. They had survived the heresy. They had survived the Scouring. They had reached the Eye with whatever they had managed to preserve. And then they started killing each other. The Emperor's children began it most directly, attacking the positions of other legions to take their slave populations. But the specific tensions of 9 armies that had been fighting side by side in pursuit of a goal that had just catastrophically failed, that now had no common enemy available for unified action, that served different patrons who had different interests and did not particularly care about the stability of an alliance that was no longer useful to them. These tensions found every available crack. The Chaos Gods were not interested in maintaining the Legion's unity once Horus was dead and the heresy had failed its specific purpose. The ruinous powers had gotten what they could from the arrangement. Khorne wanted bloodshed, and the Legion Wars provided it. Slaanesh wanted excess, and the Slave Wars provided it. Tzeentch wanted change, and the fracturing of what had been a unified force into 9 competing entities provided it. Nurgle watched the decay of a great coalition into infighting and found it comprehensible. The specific consequences. The World Eaters were shattered at the Battle of Scalathrax. The Emperor's children met the World Eaters in a confrontation that ended with the shattered remnants of what had been 2 coherent legions scattered across the Eye in warbands too small to function as military entities of the kind they had once been. Horus's body was stolen from the sons of Horus by the Emperor's children and given to Fabius Bile, whose specific ambition was to clone the dead War Master, to create a new Horus who would provide the forces of chaos with the specific quality of leadership that the original had possessed. Fabius Bile and the clone, Fabius Bile, the chief apothecary of the Emperor's children, who had spent the heresy modifying his fellow Marines in increasingly extreme ways, rewiring their nervous systems so that pain registers as pleasure, creating the Noise Marines, whose specific weapons operated on sensory overload, developing the techniques that would eventually allow him to create new Space Marines from slave stock taken in raids on Imperial worlds. He believed Horus could be recreated. The genetic material existed, the corpse was in his hands, and Primarch gene stock, once available, was in principle reproducible. He created clones, multiple versions, the specific project of rebuilding what had been destroyed through the specific mechanism of biological reproduction. He miscalculated what Abaddon would do about it. Abaddon's return. Abaddon had disappeared. After Horus died and the Scouring began, the first captain of the Sons of Horus, the man who had been Horus's most trusted battlefield commander, the warrior who had been the last survivor of the 10 Terminators fighting 40 Orcs at Ulanor, had walked into the Eye of Terror alone, a pilgrimage, a period of processing something that could not be processed in company. He returned with specific clarity about what had to happen. The clones of Horus were a blasphemy, not simply a strategic problem, though they were that too, since whoever commanded a Horus clone would have access to the specific legitimacy that Horus's name still carried among the Traitor Legions, but a blasphemy in the more fundamental sense of an attempt to substitute a copy for something irreplaceable. Horus had been corrupted, had been played by the Chaos Gods, had lost himself before he lost the war. The Horus who died on the Vengeful Spirit was not the Horus who had been the War Master, and making more copies of him would produce more of the corrupted version, rather than more of the original. Abaddon rejected this, not from affection for the original, from the specific clarity of someone who had decided that the heresy needed to be finished rather than repeated. He found the Sons of Horus shattered and leaderless at the lowest point they had reached since being created. He found Horus's corpse and his clone. He destroyed the clone. He stood over the ruins and declared himself the new War Master of Chaos, not Horus's successor in the specific sense of inheriting everything Horus had been. Something different. Someone who had learned from Horus's failure and would not repeat it. The Sons of Horus repainted their armor. Green had been their color, the specific deep green of the Lunar Wolves' earliest campaigns, and then the Sons of Horus's tenure as the War Master's Legion. They painted it black, the color of mourning, the color of the absence of what Horus had been and what the heresy had cost. They became the Black Legion. What the Black Legion was. Abaddon's first act as leader was not a military campaign. It was a declaration of principle. The Black Legion would not be the Sons of Horus under a different name. It would not be organized around the worship of Chaos Undivided as an ideology. It would be organized around a war, the Long War, the same war that the heresy had started, and that the siege of Terra's failure had not ended. The Imperium still existed. The Emperor was still in the Golden Throne. The project that Horus had failed to complete, destroying the Emperor's civilization and replacing it with something organized around chaos, was still the goal. What Horus had done wrong, moved too quickly, too directly, aimed for terror before the strategic foundation was prepared. He had launched the decisive blow before everything necessary for the decisive blow to succeed was in place. Abaddon would not repeat this error. The Long War would be exactly that. Long, patient, organized around a strategic plan he called the Crimson Path, a sequence of campaigns across millennia that would achieve what the heresy had attempted to achieve in 9 years. The Eye of Terror was not simply a refuge. It was a base, a resource pool, the origin point of a campaign that would eventually bring chaos to Terra. He had 10,000 years to work with. He used them. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and the Black Crusades are beginning. 9 legions entered the Eye of Terror. 9 different legions, each with a Primarch whose specific nature had shaped them, each with a relationship to the Chaos Gods that varied in type and depth, each carrying the specific wounds of the heresy and the Great Scouring into an environment that would spend 10,000 years working those wounds into something permanent. Tonight we follow each legion into what it became. Not the campaigns, those come later. The specific transformation of 9 military institutions into 9 different expressions of what 10 millennia inside the Eye of Terror produces. The World Eaters, the legion that consumed itself. The World Eaters entered the Eye as arguably the most purely martial of the 9 legions. The Butcher's nails had long since removed whatever capacity for strategic patience the legion had possessed. They fought. They killed. The cornate blessing they had accumulated during the heresy's later phases sat on them like a second skin. Inside the Eye, they found enemies, other legions, demons, each other. The Battle of Scalathrax was the event that ended the World Eaters as a cohesive military force. The Emperor's children had come for slaves and found a fight that suited them on a world of freezing nights and the specific circumstances that would destroy both legions' coherence simultaneously. Khan the Betrayer, one of the World Eater's most feared warriors, whose name had been earned in the specific horror of Istvan III, where he had turned his weapons on the loyalists of his own legion, fought on Scalathrax with the particular completeness that Khorne rewards. When the World Eaters began retreating from the cold to the relative safety of their own lines, Khan started burning their shelters. No retreat, no pause. Nothing but the fight, until there was nothing but the fight. The World Eaters were shattered, scattered. Angron had already ascended to demonhood, the first of the demon Primarchs, elevated by Lorgar's specific effort to drag his fellow Primarch into the immortality the Dark Gods offered. He still led the World Eaters periodically, gathering the disparate war bands into something resembling their old coherence for the specific campaigns that required the full weight of Khorne's most dedicated warriors. But as a unified legion, they were gone. What remained? Thousands of individual war bands and lone warriors scattered across the galaxy and the Eye, organized around the single goal that the Butcher's nails had always been pointing them toward. Kill, take skulls, offer the blood to the throne. In the 41st millennium, the World Eaters have one of the most recognizable aesthetics in the Chaos Space Marine range. The red and brass of Khorne's colors, the chain axes, the specific berserker charge that is their tactical signature, and one of the loosest organizational structures. They fight wherever there is fighting to be found. The Emperor's children, the search that has no end. The Emperor's children destroyed themselves at Scalathrax as thoroughly as they destroyed the World Eaters, but they destroyed themselves differently. Not in a final moment of consuming violence, but in the specific way that the pursuit of sensation destroys things that organize their existence around sensation. They lost coherence not to a single event, but to the specific centrifugal force of 10,000 individuals pursuing their own extremes in their own directions. Fulgrim ascended to demonhood, a demon prince of Slaanesh, transformed into a serpentine form of 4 arms and inhuman beauty, and the specific quality of a being whose pursuit of perfection has completed its arc, by eliminating anything that was not perfect. He inhabits a demon world that reflects his nature. He emerges occasionally for campaigns that serve his purposes and then withdraws. His legion fragmented around its different expressions of the same hunger. The Noise Marines, the warriors whose weapons operate on sensory overload, whose instruments of war are also instruments of a kind of music, became among the most recognizable Chaos Space Marine units in the setting. Each warband pursued its own approach to the same problem. What is the next thing that will register? Fabius Bile, who had been the Legion's chief apothecary, and whose specific ambition outlasted any Legion loyalty, became something separate from the Emperor's children. A figure who moves between all the Chaos factions selling his genetic services, who has been rebuilding Astartes warriors from corrupted gene seed for 10,000 years, who has accumulated knowledge of human and transhuman biology that no other being possesses. He is not simply a Chaos Space Marine. He is the specific evolution of a scientist given infinite time and no ethical constraints. The Death Guard, the plague that walks. The Death Guard entered the Eye as Nurgle's most fully realized expression in humanoid form. Mortarian's Legion, transformed in the warp during the journey to Terra, had already become Plague Marines before the siege began. What 10,000 years in the Eye did to them was deepen rather than change. Mortarian rules the Plague Planet, a demon world that reflects the specific quality of everything the Death Guard have become. Not a world of destruction, but a world of decay. Of things that persist past the point where persisting serves any conventional purpose. Of the specific Nurglen theology that sees entropy not as loss, but as change. Everything becoming something else. Nothing truly destroyed. The specific comfort of a god who refuses to acknowledge that endings are real. Typhus, the first captain who had betrayed Mortarion before Mortarion had decided to betray anyone, became the herald of Nurgle. A figure whose specific role in the Death Guard's history gave him a complicated relationship with the Primarch, whose corruption he had engineered. He carries the Destroyer Hive, a swarm of demonic plague insects that inhabit his Terminator armor and pour forth in battle as a weapon of biological devastation. He is among the Death Guard's most active field commanders in the 41st millennium, spreading plague to populations across the Imperium in ways that serve Nurgle's specific interest in cultivating new diseases. The Death Guard have retained more Legion coherence than most. Mortarion is still present and occasionally active. The specific quality of their patron god, whose gifts include immunity to despair as much as immunity to biological harm, who offers the comfort of an existence that cannot be easily diminished, suits a legion that was always defined by endurance rather than aggression. The Thousand Sons, the scholars in amber. The Thousand Sons entered the Eye already broken. The rubric of Ahriman had transformed most of the Legion into the rubric Marines, walking armor occupied by the whispers of souls that could no longer fully exist in the conventional sense. The living psychers who remained, the sorcerers, were the only ones who could command these animated husks. Magnus rules the planet of the sorcerers, Sortiarius, a demon world that Tzeentch transported from the ruins of Prospero, preserving the city of Tisca and its libraries across the journey. The Thousand Sons are scholars in the most specific sense. They pursue knowledge not as an abstract value, but as the specific tool that their warp powers require. Understanding the nature of the universe is not simply intellectual for them. It is the mechanism by which their sorcery functions. Ahriman was exiled. The man who cast the rubric, whose attempt at mercy had turned his non-psychic brothers to dust in their armor, was expelled from the Legion by Magnus's fury. He has spent 10,000 years on a quest to enter the Black Library, the Elders' repository of the most dangerous knowledge in the galaxy, and find within it the means to undo the rubric. Not to restore what was lost, to find something that would move the situation past where it is. Whether the rubric can be undone, whether Ahriman's quest can succeed, whether the specific tragedy of a man who tried to save his brothers and destroyed them is resolvable. The lore explores this across decades of Black Library novels without reaching a definitive conclusion. The Night Lords. Terror without a master. The Night Lords were unique among the Traitor Legions in one specific way. They did not flee immediately to the Eye of Terror. When Horus fell and the Scouring began, the Night Lords were at nearly full strength. They had not borne the worst of the siege's losses. They continued operations in the galaxy's eastern regions for years after the Heresy's formal end, conducting terror campaigns against Imperial worlds with the specific freedom of a legion that had no orders anymore, and found orders had always been a constraint rather than a guide. Conrad Kurz was dead, killed by his own assassin in the specific way he had foreseen and accepted. The Night Lords without their Primarch were the Night Lords freed from the specific ambivalence that Kurz had always represented. A figure who used terror as a tool and hated himself for using it. Without Kurz, there was no self-hatred to moderate the tool's use. They became what they had always been heading toward. They are not chaos undivided in the devout sense. They are not dedicated to any specific god. They kill and terrorize because killing and terrorizing is what they do. Not as an expression of religious devotion, but as the expression of a military culture that has had 10,000 years to lose its last connection to any purpose beyond itself. In the 41st millennium, the Night Lords operate as scattered war bands across the galaxy, rather than as a concentrated force in the eye. They spread terror, not as a strategic tool for achieving larger goals, but as a practice in its own right. Their warriors are among the most feared opponents in the Warhammer 40,000 universe for the specific reason that they are effective rather than fanatical. They know what they are doing, and they choose to do it. The Iron Warriors. The siege that never ended, Perturabo and the Iron Warriors entered the Eye with their specific military genius intact. What they built in Medrengard, their demon world, a place of black sun and white sky where the surface has been covered with fortress architecture, where towers rise impossibly high and dungeons plunge impossibly deep, and the entire world is an expression of a mind that cannot stop building defenses against things that have not attacked yet, is the Iron Warrior's identity in architectural form. Perturabo ascended to demonhood at Sebastus IV, the world where he conducted an operation against the Imperial Fists that cost his legion heavily, but achieved what he had designed it to achieve. The Imperial Fist gene seed, offered to the Chaos Gods, was the price. The apotheosis was the reward. From Medrengard, the Iron Warriors conduct the specific campaigns that their doctrine suits: sieges, fortresses, the reduction of fortified positions that other legions cannot address. They are the Chaos Space Marines who appear when something needs to be broken that is very difficult to break, and they bring the specific patient methodology that Perturabo's genius had always produced. Their relationship to chaos is more transactional than devout. They use what the gods offer. They do not worship in the passionate sense that the word-bearers worship. They are engineers of destruction who happen to operate within a religious framework they find less interesting than the technical problems their warfare presents. The word-bearers. the faithful who found what they were looking for. The Word-Bearers are the only Traitor Legion that still maintains the rank of chaplain. The darkly ironic version, the Dark Apostles, whose role combines what the original chaplains did with the specific fervour of the Chaos worship that had been the Word-Bearers' goal before the heresy. Their home world in the eye is Sycharis, a world where the Word-Bearers maintain the organizational structure they had always used, where their demon-possessed warriors called Possessed Marines walk openly, where the specific theological tradition that Lorgar built still functions. They are the most organizationally coherent of the Traitor Legions, after the Death Guard and the Black Legion. Lorgar himself entered a meditative isolation that has lasted 10,000 years. He has not been observed acting in the material universe since the end of the heresy. His legion operates without him, or rather, has been operating on the framework he established so thoroughly that his direct presence is not required. The Word-Bearers know what they are doing. They have always known. They are doing what Lorgar designed them to do. They spread the worship of chaos. They create cults. They incite uprisings. They corrupt planetary populations from within, rather than attacking from without. When an imperial world falls to chaos through internal revolution, rather than military assault, the Word-Bearers are usually somewhere in the background. The Alpha Legion, the question that has no answer. What are the Alpha Legion? This is the question that 10,000 years of operation and multiple detailed studies by the Imperium's best intelligence agencies have not resolved. The most complex, most contradictory, most deliberately obscure of the Traitor Legions continues to be the most deliberately obscure of the Traitor Legions. They do not base themselves in the Eye of Terror. They operate throughout the galaxy. Their agents are embedded in imperial institutions, including, it is believed, Space Marine chapters, including the Inquisition itself. Their specific doctrine of infiltration and misdirection has not changed. If anything, 10,000 years of practice has refined it. Whether they serve chaos, whether they serve a purpose entirely their own, whether Alfarius and Omegan are alive, dead, both, neither. Whether the Alpha Legion is coordinating its scattered warbands toward a goal, or simply operating as individual bands with a shared identity and aesthetic. Whether the information about their goals that they allow to be discovered is accurate. I am Alfarius. That is what you will find if you ask any of them. The Demon Primarchs, 6 of the 9 Traitor Primarchs, survive in some form in the 41st millennium, as Demon Princes. Angron, Magnus, Fulgrim, Mortarion, Lorgar, Perturabo. Each inhabiting a demon world, each occasionally emerging for campaigns of specific significance. None of them consistently leading their legions, all of them representing the theoretical highest authority over their former warriors, an authority that is rarely exercised. The gap between a demon prince's capability and the ordinary life of a Chaos Space Marine warband is large enough that the Primarchs function as apocalyptic interventions rather than regular leaders. When Magnus appears on a battlefield, it changes what that battlefield can contain. When Angron leads a campaign, it is because the campaign is significant enough to justify the specific attention of a being who can fight demon Primarchs directly. The day-to-day of the Long War is conducted by the Chaos Lords and Warsmiths and Dark Apostles and Sorcerers who command the individual war bands. They are not waiting for their Primarchs to return. They are fighting the Long War because it is what they are. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the Black Crusades are about to begin. The Crimson Path. That is what Abaddon called it. The strategic plan that would span millennia. that would achieve what the Horus Heresy had failed to achieve, that would take the long war from the Eye of Terror to terror itself. Not in one grand assault, in 13 steps. Each Black Crusade was a step, not simply an attempt to conquer the Cadian Gate that happened to fail, a specific operation with a specific objective, designed to advance the plan in ways that the Imperium, which measured success by territory held rather than by the strategic architecture being assembled, largely failed to recognize until it was too late. For a long time, the law presented the Black Crusades as 12 failures and 1 success. The Imperium repelled 12 incursions and then failed to repel the 13th. Abaddon's reputation suffered from this framing. 12 losses before 1 win is not the record of a military genius. What the deeper law reveals, the first 12 were not failures. Each one accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. The Imperium won the battles it fought. It won them while losing the war it did not realize was being fought. The first Black Crusade, 781 M31. The demonstration, 5 centuries after the Horus Heresy's end. Abaddon had spent those centuries building the Black Legion, consolidating the scattered sons of Horus, absorbing warbands from every other Traitor Legion under the Black Legion's banner, defeating rivals including Thegus Daravec, a Death Guard sorcerer lord who had his own claim to the title of Chaos Warmaster. When the first Black Crusade emerged from the Eye of Terror, the Imperium had not yet built its defenses. There was no fortress world of Cadia as later generations would know it. The Cadian Gate, the relatively navigable section of the Eye's perimeter through which large forces could exit into real space, was not yet the fortified choke point that the Imperium would eventually make it. Abaddon led the largest unified chaos force since the Heresy. Hundreds of worlds fell in the first weeks. The forces of chaos plunged the worlds of the Segmentum Obscurus into a terrible conflict that ravaged hundreds of worlds for several solar decades. His specific objective, a demon sword. At the conclusion of the Crusade's initial campaigning, Abaddon navigated to the world of Uralan, a place in the Eye of Terror's shadow, where the Chaos Gods had stored something of extraordinary value, the Tower of Silence. Within, Abaddon recovered the demon sword Drachnian, after battling his way through a haunted labyrinth. The howling sword contained the bound essence of an ancient and dangerous warp entity, who had once been defeated by the Emperor himself. Drachnian, a blade that could rend reality wherever it struck. The first Black Crusade's military campaigns were the price paid for the sword. The lives spent on hundreds of worlds were the transaction that the Chaos Gods required in exchange for telling Abaddon where the weapon was hidden. The Imperium stopped the crusade. Sigismund, the Imperial Fist, first captain, who had defeated every traitor champion at the Siege of Terror, who had founded the Black Templars and led them on continuous crusade ever since, found Abaddon. Their duel ended with both gravely wounded. It took Sigismund's and allegedly Rogel Dawn's life to stop the crusade. The Imperium won the first Black Crusade. Abaddon emerged from it with Drachnian, the talon of Horus he had already possessed, and the demonstrated ability to marshal the Traitor Legions under his banner. The demonstration was the point. The Second Black Crusade, 597 M32. The poisoning. By the Second Crusade, the Imperium had learned. Cadia was being fortified. The specific fortress world that would become the anchor of the Cadian Gate's defenses for the next 9,000 years was under construction. The naval port at Bellis Corona was being established. The Imperium was building walls against what Abaddon had shown he could do. Abaddon led the Second Crusade against these defences. The military engagements were fierce. Cadia held. The Imperium counted this as a victory. What Abaddon had actually done. On the outermost moons of the Bellis Corona system, he performed a ritual, a curse sunk into the core of the moon itself, designed to awaken centuries later and unleash a plague upon the defenders. The Second Crusade's apparent defeat left a time-delayed infection in the systems the Imperium was most proud of defending. The Imperium did not know. The war they had won had a consequence that would not arrive for centuries. Abaddon had not simply attacked and been repelled. He had poisoned the well on the way out. The Third Black Crusade, 909.M32. The Desecration, the host of Talamin. The Third Black Crusade is notable for a specific act of deliberate religious offence, the desecration of the remains of Saint Gerstal, a holy figure of the imperial cult, whose relics were venerated on a world near the Cadian Gate. The destruction of sacred relics is not simply vandalism. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where the Emperor's divine presence is channeled through the faith of billions, and where the specific locations and objects associated with sanctified figures carry genuine spiritual significance, the systematic destruction of holy sites damages the psychic infrastructure of imperial faith. It weakens the specific resonance that faith produces in the warp. It damages morale in ways that military defeats cannot. Abaddon was attacking the Imperium's spiritual foundation, not simply its military one. The Fourth Black Crusade, 001.M34. The slaughter, the devastation of Elfanor, the death of the Cromarch, the destruction of the Grand Citadel of Cromarch, a fortress that served as one of the regional military anchors of the Cadian Gate's defense network. The specific significance, the Cromarch system, was more than a military installation. It was a command center, the place from which a significant portion of the Gate's defensive coordination was managed. Destroying it created a specific gap in the defensive architecture that would require years to rebuild, and that would remain a vulnerability throughout the rebuilding period. The Fourth Crusade was not stopped by destroying the Citadel. The Black Legion withdrew after the Citadel fell, having achieved what they came for. The Imperium occupied the ruins and began reconstruction. They counted it as holding the line. Abaddon had removed a piece of the wall. The Fifth Black Crusade, 723. M36. The Massacre, the Tide of Blood, the Scouring of Elysia. The Fifth Black Crusade is most notable for what happened to two Space Marine chapters. Abaddon summoned the demon Prince Doombreed and destroyed the Warhawks and Venerators chapters. Two entire Space Marine chapters, roughly 2,000 warriors, each one requiring decades to produce, each one carrying a genetic legacy that traced back to the first founding legions. Destroyed, not defeated in battle with survivors retreating to rebuild. Destroyed, completely. This is the scale of destruction that the Black Crusades could achieve, even when the overall military objective was not met. The Warhawks and Venerators are among the confirmed casualties of the Long War, chapters that existed and no longer do, whose gene seed lines ended in a single campaign. Doombreed, a demon prince of Khorne, whose mortal identity the lore suggests was one of the great conquerors of human history before the Imperium, one of those rare mortals whose martial excellence was so complete that Khorne preserved them in demonic form, served as the specific instrument of this massacre. The Sixth Black Crusade, 901.M36. The Consolidation, Drekkarth's Folly. The Sixth Black Crusade had a different character from the others. Its primary objective was internal rather than imperial. Acting on a tip-off from Be'lakor, Abaddon allied with the Sons of the Eye, a splinter faction that had broken off from the Sons of Horus shortly after the Siege of Terra. After annihilating a Forge world with their help, Abaddon executed the Sun's warlord and forced him to watch his men pledge their loyalty to the Black Legion as he died. The Sons of the Eye were a significant force, a splinter that had maintained its own identity and capability outside Abaddon's direct control for centuries. Integrating them into the Black Legion through the specific method of using them in a campaign and then eliminating their independent leadership was the kind of organizational consolidation that characterizes Abaddon's approach to building a military force. He did not simply defeat rivals, he incorporated their resources. The Forge world annihilated in this crusade was not collateral damage. It was a specific target, a production facility whose destruction removed industrial capability from the Imperium, and whose ruins served the long-term goal of degrading the infrastructure that sustained Imperial military strength. The 7th Black Crusade, 811 M37, the Ghost War, called this because Abaddon's forces were so elusive during this crusade, striking and withdrawing before organized Imperial responses could be assembled, appearing in locations that defensive intelligence had not predicted, conducting operations that accomplished specific objectives and then disappeared. His primary objectives in the 7th Crusade: Elder artifacts held by the Adeptus Mechanicus, specific items of psychic and strategic significance, whose acquisition served the long-term preparations for the 13th Crusade's specific requirements. The Adeptus Mechanicus's own records do not fully account for what was taken, which suggests that some items were removed from facilities without the Mechanicus immediately realizing they were gone. He also conducted an engagement on the planet of Makan against the Blood Angels. The specific nature of this encounter: Abaddon tore Captain Acrian of the Blood Angels completely apart with the Talon of Horus. The Ravager's 7th Company was completely slaughtered, carried symbolic weight beyond the military outcome. Abaddon, using the Talon of Horus, the weapon that had been his Primarch's, against the descendants of Sanguinius, who had died at Horus's hands, was a specific echo of the heresy's most emotionally significant moment. It was not accidental. The larger pattern: 7 Crusades, 7 centuries. The Imperium had won 7 military campaigns and lost thousands of worlds temporarily, 2 Space Marine chapters permanently, the remains of a saint, a fortress citadel, a Forge world's production capacity, and a collection of elder artifacts whose significance it had not fully understood. What Abaddon had built: a network of damage across the Cadian Gate's defensive infrastructure, specific military capabilities degraded, specific spiritual resources depleted, specific items in his possession that would be needed for operations the Imperium could not anticipate, because it did not know what he was building toward. The Crimson Path. Each of these Black Crusades actually had a larger, secret purpose known to Abaddon, which was intended in ultimately paving the way for a final, massive assault upon the Imperial fortress world of Cadia. He was not trying to win the Cadian Gate in any of the first 7 Crusades. He was undermining the foundations of the structure that defended it, one campaign at a time, over more than a millennium. The Imperium defended itself brilliantly. It won every battle that it recognized as a battle. It did not notice that it was losing something else. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and the pace is about to accelerate. The first 7 Black Crusades had been preparation. military campaigns that removed pieces of the Imperium's defensive architecture, that accumulated specific resources, that demonstrated Abaddon's authority over the Chaos forces and his ability to marshal the Traitor Legions toward unified purpose. The last 5 before the final assault accelerated. The operations became more ambitious, the weapons acquired more extraordinary, the damage inflicted more permanent. The 8th Black Crusade, 999 M37, the equation, the Skullgather. The 8th Crusade had a specific objective that the Imperium, analyzing the damage afterward, found deeply disturbing, not because of what was destroyed, but because of what the destruction was arranged to create. Abaddon appeased the changer of ways with sequences of death, the specific arrangements of casualties and military actions creating a mathematical equation of terrible and profane perfection. Not random violence, not even purposeful military violence. A specific pattern, organized into something that satisfied the architect of fate's requirements for an exchange of power. What Tzeentch gave in return for the equation is not documented in Imperial records. What it was used for, what specific capability it granted Abaddon that he did not previously possess, is something that the subsequent Crusades events suggest was significant, even if the specific nature of the gift is not confirmed. The Imperium counted the 8th Crusade as a repelled incursion. It had been a transaction conducted at humanity's expense. The 9th Black Crusade, 573 M38, the Invisible War, the Starving of Cancephalus. The 9th Crusade is notable for the specific method by which it was conducted. Several Chaos fleets left the Eye of Terror undetected during what the records call the Anticanis Massacre. Undetected. This is the specific detail that distinguishes the 9th Crusade from every other Black Crusade. It happened, at least in part, without the Imperium knowing it was happening. Forces moved through Imperial space, accomplished objectives, and left before the defensive response had even fully organized. What they accomplished at Cancephalus itself, the starving of a world, the specific destruction of food production and supply systems rather than military targets, demonstrates the breadth of what Chaos Space Marines could achieve when operating outside the framing of a conventional military engagement. Not a battle, an economic siege conducted by forces that the targeted population did not know were present. The 10th Black Crusade, 001.M39, the Iron War, the conflict of Helica. Abaddon and the Iron Warriors fought the Iron Hands at Medusa. The Iron Hands, the successors of Ferrus Manus, whose gene seed line had been preserved despite the Primarch's death at Istvan V, held Medusa as their fortress world. The Iron Warriors and the Iron Hands, the Traitor Legion of siege masters against the Loyalist chapter, defined by the mechanical replacement of the flesh, its culture considered weak. The symmetry is deliberate. Perturabo had killed Ferrus Manus's closest successor tradition by fighting the people who kept his memory most vigorously. The Iron Warriors against the Iron Hands is one of the Long War's most specific personal conflicts. The specific animosity between two militaries that both organized themselves around metal and machinery, and the systematic reduction of any obstacle. And the 10th Crusade provided an arena for it. Medusa held. The Iron Warriors withdrew. What had been accomplished at a strategic level was the kind of attritional damage that the Crimson Path was designed to accumulate across centuries. The 11th Black Crusade, 301.M39, the experiment, the doom of Reloria. The most unusual of the Black Crusades. Unusual because its stated primary purpose had nothing to do with the Imperium directly. Abaddon abducted thousands of orcs to conduct experiments on their use of the warp. The orc relationship to the warp is unlike any other species. Their psychic ability is collective rather than individual. They do not produce psychers who are separately gifted, but rather a gestalt psychic field that emerges from large concentrations of orcs and that causes their technology to function in ways that should not be physically possible. An orc gun that should not fire does fire, because enough orcs believe it will. The principle is documented. The mechanism is not fully understood. Abaddon abducted thousands of orcs to study this mechanism. What he learned from the experiment and how the knowledge was applied to subsequent operations is not documented in accessible Imperial records. What is implied? That something about how orcs use the warp can be leveraged by forces of chaos in ways that conventional warp manipulation cannot achieve. The world of Reloria paid the price for this research in the specific way that worlds near where major chaos operations are conducted tend to pay. Its doom was thorough, its population not surviving the Crusade's withdrawal. The 12th Black Crusade, 139. M41. The Gothic War. The Gothic War. The most documented of Abaddon's first 12 Black Crusades, the one whose events were the subject of the Battlefleet Gothic Specialist game, the one that produced one of the most consequential acquisitions in the Long War's entire history. The Gothic Sector, a region of the Segmentum Obscurus, whose strategic significance had been recognized since the early Imperium, not simply for its populations or its industrial output, but for the specific objects scattered across it. 6 massive artificial constructs, each larger than any Imperial starship, each of unknown origin, each of architectural complexity that the Adeptus Mechanicus had spent centuries studying without fully comprehending. The Blackstone fortresses, called the Talismans of Vaul by the Elder, who knew what they actually were, or at least knew more than the Imperium did about their origins and capabilities. The Imperium had pressed them into service as naval fortifications, refitting them with Imperial weapon systems, using them as bases for Battlefleet Gothic. They were extraordinary platforms even in this repurposed form. Their true capabilities were something else entirely. A single Blackstone fortress could destroy a planet. 3 working in concert could destroy a star. Abaddon knew what they were. His sorcerers, led by Zaraphiston, had located 2 specific artifacts called the Hand of Darkness and the Eye of Night, which served as the activation keys for the Blackstone Fortress's original systems. With these, he could do what the Adeptus Mechanicus could not, actually use these weapons as their builders had intended. The Gothic War's course. The Gothic sector was isolated by warp storms when the 12th Crusade began. The specific chaos weather that Abaddon's operations had learned to generate and exploit, cutting off communication between the sector and the wider Imperium for nearly a decade. His first move? Destroy a cardinal world, Savavan, a planet of the Ecclesiarchy, a center of imperial religious authority with a population of 14 billion. The Planet Killer, a warship Abaddon had been constructing in the Eye of Terror, a vessel whose primary weapon was designed to destroy entire worlds, took orbit above Savavan. The warship took orbit over Saravan, and with a blast of its powerful main weapons, blew the world to pieces, taking 14 billion Imperial citizens with it. 14 billion people, destroyed not as a side effect of military operations, but as a deliberate demonstration. This is what I have. This is what the Gothic sector is facing. What will you spend to stop me? The Blackstone fortresses fell one by one. a fleet of 20 Chaos warships overran the Rebo system and captured one of the Blackstone fortresses after its power system had mysteriously shut down. Then another at Brinaga. Then a third at Fularis II, where Abaddon demonstrated the fortress's capabilities for the first time by using one to scour the planet bare, stripping its atmosphere, transforming its surface into a dead plain. Then a fourth was captured. The fortresses remaining in Imperial hands eventually self-destructed. The mechanism by which this happened is still debated. Were they programmed to destroy themselves before falling into enemy control? Did something activate the self-destruct remotely? The Angels of Redemption boarding party found no crew, no resistance, just empty corridors and then nothing. When the warp storms cleared and Imperial reinforcements arrived, Abaddon withdrew. He retreated into the Eye of Terror with 2 Blackstone fortresses that he had captured and maintained and was taking home. The 2 remaining Blackstones were seized by the despoiler and twisted to fulfill his own objectives. The Imperium counted the Gothic War as a victory because it had repelled the Crusade. The Cadian Gate was intact. The Gothic sector was damaged but surviving. Abaddon had come to the Gothic sector to acquire 2 specific weapons of mass destruction. He left with both. What 12 Crusades had built. Step back and look at what the Crimson Path's first 12 stages had assembled. Drachnion, the demon sword that could rend reality wherever it struck. The Talon of Horus, the ancient weapon of the Primarch that was itself a force of extraordinary destruction. The artifacts from the 7th Crusade's looting of Elder holdings. The Tzeentchian gift from the mathematical equation of the 8th Crusade. The knowledge of Orc warp use from the 11th, and 2 Blackstone fortresses capable of destroying planets. The Cadian Gate's defences had been degraded by 12 campaigns across 9,000 years. The Wall, the network of fortress worlds and naval installations and the Cadian pylons, the ancient Necron-built structures that suppressed the Eye of Terror's expansion, had been weakened in specific ways at specific points that would only become apparent when the final assault began. The Traitor Legions had been welded into something that Abaddon could call together. Not permanently unified, not capable of sustained cooperation against their own internecine nature, but capable of being assembled for the specific duration of a campaign that required them all. And the Imperium was 9,000 years older than it had been when Abaddon began. 9,000 years of the specific decay that the Chaos Gods fed on, the fear and fanaticism and stagnation that the post-heresy Imperium had settled into as its permanent condition. 9,000 years during which the Golden Throne had been consuming 1,000 psychers a day, and the Astronomicon had been burning through human life at the rate of a civilization's hope. Abaddon stood at the gates of the Eye of Terror and looked at what he had built. He had never been trying to win the Gothic War. He had never been trying to hold Cadian territory through the first 12 Crusades. He had been patient across 9 millennia, building the specific instruments the 13th required. The 13th would be different. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and Cadia is burning. 999 M41, the 41st millennium, the final year of it, the year that the Imperium had been warned about in prophecies and dread omens across centuries, the year that everything changed. Abaddon launched the 13th Black Crusade. What was different this time? Every previous Black Crusade had been massive. Every previous Black Crusade had caused damage that required years or decades to repair. But every previous Black Crusade had also, in the Imperium's accounting, been repelled. The Cadian Gate had held. The Eye of Terror had not expanded. The Long War had continued, but on terms the Imperium could survive. The 13th was different from the moment it began, not simply in scale, though the scale was unprecedented since the Horus Heresy itself, different in kind. Abaddon raised the greatest army in service to the Chaos Gods since the time of Horus, and intended to bring an end to the Long War by driving on terror, slaying the Emperor of Mankind upon his golden throne, and at last completing the task the Traitor Legions had begun millennia before. Before launching, Abaddon gathered the blessings of the demon Primarchs, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Angron, Mortarion, Magnus, and Lorgar. The specific act of gathering 6 demon Primarchs' sanction for a campaign was not simply ceremonial. It represented the most complete alignment of Chaos's most powerful individual actors behind a single strategic objective that the Long War had ever achieved. He brought the Planet Killer. He brought the 2 Blackstone fortresses from the Gothic War, held in the eye for 800 years, maintained and prepared. He brought the collected instruments of 12 Crusades' careful accumulation. Cadia, the fortress world at the Cadian Gate, the most heavily fortified planet in the Imperium outside of Terra itself, the specific location that the Chaos Gods had been trying to breach since Abaddon's very first crusade, the anchor of the Cadian pylons, the ancient Necron-built structures that suppress the Eye of Terror's natural expansion. The Cadian military tradition was the specific product of a world that had been on the front line of chaos incursions for 10,000 years. Shock troopers whose entire civilization was organized around military excellence. From birth, Cadians trained. From childhood they drilled. From adolescence they served. The forward elements of the Black Fleet of Abaddon were ultimately forced to retreat from the Cadia system by the combined forces of the Imperial Navy and the Necrons. The initial assault was repelled. The Necrons, the ancient undead species, whose pylons had been suppressing the Eye for longer than the Imperium had existed, who had their own reasons for preventing the Eye's expansion, fought alongside the Imperium. Lord Castellan Ursarker E. Creed, the most celebrated Cadian commander of his generation, organized the defense with the specific strategic genius that his career had documented across decades. Cadia held. The first assault was repelled. The Imperium counted it as a victory. The second assault. Abaddon launched a second, far larger assault on the Cadian Gate that unleashed the full demonic fury of the Eye of Terror directly upon an already battered Cadia. The second assault used what the first assault had not. The Blackstone fortress, called the Will of Eternity, moved into position. Its weapons targeted Cadia directly. The ancient alien technology, fully operational for the first time since the Gothic War, focused on the fortress world that had been the wall's anchor. The Imperial Fist's Star Fortress phalanx engaged it. A Space Wolves boarding party disabled the Will of Eternity's shields. The phalanx's weapons damaged the Blackstone sufficiently to prevent it from fully destroying Cadia through its primary weapons. But Abaddon had anticipated this. If the weapon could not fire, it could still fall. He had the massive fragments of the Will of Eternity hurled from orbit like an artificial asteroid onto the surface of Cadia. The strike destroyed what remained of Cadia's faltering defenses and the network of Necron-built Cadian pylons that had long prevented the Eye of Terror from naturally expanding into the Cadian Gate. The pylons, the structures that had suppressed the Eye's expansion for 60 million years, since the Necrons had built them, since before humanity existed as a species, were destroyed by the kinetic impact of a Blackstone fortress used as a thrown rock. Within only solar hours, most of Cadia was in the process of being consumed by the Imperium, when the tectonic instability caused by the impact of the Blackstone Fortress finally caused Cadia to tear itself apart. Cadia broke. Not simply fell to military occupation, broke. The planet itself tore apart. The fortress world that had stood as the Imperium's bulwark against chaos for 10,000 years ceased to exist as a physical location. What Creed did, Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, is among the most celebrated figures in the Fall of Cadia's documentation. His strategic genius, the specific quality of command that allowed him to extract maximum defensive value from a force that was being overwhelmed, kept Cadia fighting far longer than any objective assessment of the military situation would have predicted. His final fate is classified. He was last seen standing on Cadia's surface as the evacuation proceeded around him, directing the withdrawal of his forces with the specific completeness of someone who understood that the people leaving needed someone to organize the departure. Whether he died on Cadia, whether he was captured, whether he found some other exit, the records mark him as missing. His aide, Jaron Kell, died beside him, one of the millions of Cadians who died defending what could not ultimately be held. The survivors evacuated. The world that had produced them, the civilization organized entirely around the defense of the Cadian Gate, the specific military culture that had made Cadian shock troopers the most renowned soldiers in the Imperium, was gone. Cadians in the 41st millennium are a people without a homeworld, carrying the tradition of a place that no longer exists. The gate is open. The 13th Black Crusade had been a triumph for the servants of the Dark Gods, and the Eye of Terror began to slowly expand without limit, opening Abaddon the Despoiler's coveted crimson path to terror and creating the Great Rift. Without the pylons, there was nothing suppressing the Eye's natural expansion. The boundary that had been maintained by Necron technology for 60 million years dissolved. The Eye of Terror began to grow, not toward the Cadian Gate specifically, but into the space around it, expanding outward in all directions, consuming the regions adjacent to it in the specific way that the Imperium expands when its containment fails. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the galaxy-spanning tear between real space and the warp, formed in the months following Cadia's fall. Not simply the Eye of Terror expanding, a new wound in reality running from the Eye of Terror in the northwest of the galaxy all the way across to the Hadex anomaly in the southeast. The galaxy split in half. The Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, the northern half of the human civilization that had been separated from the Astronomicon by the Great Rift, was cut off from Terra, from Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, from the light that made warp travel possible across the half of the galaxy it no longer reached. The Crimson Path had always been about this, not simply taking Cadia, removing the suppression that kept the Eye of Terror from expanding, creating the galaxy-spanning warp catastrophe that would eventually consume Terra itself. Abaddon did not march on Terra in the year 999 M41, but the Great Rift was the specific precondition for the march on Terra that the Crimson Path had always been building toward. The Gathering Storm. In the chaos of Cadia's fall, a handful of Imperial heroes had successfully escaped the fall of Cadia with the aid of the newborn Eldar faction, known as the Inari, through a webway gate found on the ice moon of Clysus in the Cadian system. Saint Celestine, the living saint of the Adepta Sororitas, a figure of divine intervention who had died and been resurrected multiple times across her career, whose miraculous capabilities were among the most reliably documented divine interventions in the Imperium's recent history. Inquisitor Greyfax, Belisarius Cawl, the Archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose specific project, the development of the Primaris Space Marines, had been ongoing for 10,000 years at Guilliman's instruction. The Celestinian Crusade, this group called themselves. Together, these Imperials would forge an uneasy alliance with the Xenos that would offer a new hope for the servants of the Emperor in their fight against the waxing power of the archenemy, the resurrection of the Primarch Reboot Guilliman. Guilliman had been in stasis since shortly after the Horus Heresy, wounded by Fulgrim's demon-poisoned blade, preserved in a stasis field for 10,000 years. The Celestinian Crusade, with Eldar assistance and the specific technology that Cawl had developed, brought him back. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the man who had written the Codex Astartes, restructured the Space Marine Legions into chapters, built the post-Heresy Imperium's institutional framework, woke to a galaxy that had changed in ways that 10,000 years of stasis had not prepared him for. His reaction to the Imperium of the 41st millennium, the theocracy, the stagnation, the specific betrayal of everything he had designed, is one of the most emotionally complex things in the current setting. He was furious, he was horrified, and he was the most capable administrator and military commander who had been alive since the Horus Heresy, in a galaxy that needed both. What 13 Crusades achieved, Cadia was gone. The pylons were destroyed. The Great Rift had formed. The galaxy was split, but Abaddon had not won completely. The Imperium survived. Guilliman returned and launched the Indomitus Crusade, deploying the Primaris Space Marines that Cawl had been developing for 10,000 years, reinforcing the devastated sectors, organizing the military response to the Great Rift's consequences. The march on terror that the Crimson Path had been building toward was not yet at the gates. The long war continues. The Great Rift is real. The Imperium Nihilus exists. The Eye of Terror is expanding. And Abaddon the Despoiler is still alive, still in the Eye, having accomplished what 9,000 years of preparation had been designed to accomplish. He is not won, but the galaxy he is fighting in is the galaxy the Crimson Path was designed to create. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the war does not end with Cadia. The Chaos Space Marines are not simply a military force or a religious faction. They are 10,000 years of individuals, specific beings with specific histories, who have survived what should have killed them, who have been shaped by what they have served and what they have done, who carry the long war in their bodies and their memories with a specificity that no abstract ideology can fully account for. Tonight we follow the most remarkable of them, not the Primarchs. They have their own stories, told elsewhere in this series. The champions, the individuals who have become, in 10,000 years of the long war, something that no conventional military record can fully describe. Khan, the betrayer. He was not always the betrayer. Before Scalathrax, before the title that followed him forever afterward, Khan was the most respected warrior captain in the World Eaters, the equerry of Angron, the one warrior whose specific combination of martial excellence and the quality of still being able to think in the midst of the Butcher's Nail's influence had made him, paradoxically, the most reliable of Angron's officers. He had been loyal at Istvan III, among the World Eaters who had not sided with Angron in the massacre, one of those who fought for their lives on the surface. He survived. He continued fighting. Scalathrax broke something. the World Eaters retreating from the cold, not from the Emperor's children, not from any military threat, but from weather, was a thing that the butcher's nails could not process. The specific logic of the implants. Pain is relieved only by violence. Retreat is denial of violence. Therefore, retreat is unacceptable. When the World Eaters began finding shelter rather than fighting, Khan took a flamer and began burning their shelters, his own side. He burned his own side's shelters to keep them fighting, to keep them in the cold and in the combat that the nails demanded. His battle brothers killed in the chaos that followed, not by the Emperor's children, but by each other, by the specific madness that Scalathrax produced. Khan killed many of them himself. He earned the title in the truest sense, by demonstrating that for him, the nails had completely won. There was no person left inside the killing that could say no to the killing. In the 41st millennium, Khan is one of the most feared individual warriors on any battlefield. He is described as the most proficient killer to have ever served the blood god among the mortal ranks of chaos. He does not distinguish between enemies and allies. The betrayer has earned the title again and again across 10,000 years. He serves Khorne's most absolute demand, that blood be shed, regardless of whose. Lucius the Eternal. The Curse of Lucius is one of the most specifically designed horrors in the Chaos Space Marines catalogue of abominations. He cannot be permanently killed. When someone kills him, they must experience, however briefly, the sensation of satisfaction, the specific pleasure of having killed one of the greatest swordsmen alive. That flash of pleasure, if it is present, is enough. It marks the killer as someone who found pleasure in killing. And Slaanesh feeds on that marking. Over the course of hours or days, the killer is consumed. Their body transforms. Their identity is subsumed. What was their body becomes Lucius's body, rebuilt, reformed, with Lucius's personality and memories reconstituting themselves within the new shell. The killer's own consciousness is reduced to a screaming mask, embedded in the regenerated armor, adding one more face to the collection of those who failed to end him. What this means practically, anyone who kills Lucius must do so without any satisfaction, without any pleasure in the act, purely instrumentally, without any of the emotional response that killing a great enemy tends to generate. This is almost impossible to achieve in the heat of combat. He has accumulated the faces of his killers across 10,000 years. His armor is a gallery of faces, each one someone who thought they had ended him, each one now part of what he is. He is Slaanesh's champion in the most complete sense, a being whose immortality is directly derived from the specific sin that Slaanesh most directly governs. Typhus, Herald of Nurgle. The Herald of Nurgle. The first captain who had betrayed Mortarion before Mortarion had decided to betray anyone, who had engineered the Death Guard's corruption in the warp, who had arranged for Nurgle's transformation of the Legion to be the only available option by the time Mortarion recognized what was happening. In the 41st millennium, Typhus is among the most active of the Death Guard's senior figures. He carries the Destroyer Hive, the swarm of demonic plague insects that inhabits his Terminator armor, that pours forth in battle as a living weapon, that spreads the diseases that Nurgle has cultivated with the specific care that the Father of Plagues brings to his garden. He is, in some specific sense, the most responsible for what the Death Guard became. Mortarion was corrupted because Typhus arranged it. The Legion was transformed because Typhus ensured the transformation was the only way out. The specific guilt of that, if Chaos Space Marines can be said to carry guilt, sits in Typhus's history in a way that his relationship with Mortarion reflects. He serves under the Primarch he betrayed. The arrangement has not been acknowledged in ways that suggest resolution. He continues to spread plague. He led the Plague Fleet in the 13th Black Crusade. The Death Guard elements that advanced alongside the Blackstone fortresses, spreading Nurgle's diseases ahead of the military assault. He is diligent, patient, thorough. The qualities that made him a Death Guard officer before the heresy, expressed now through the cultivation of disease rather than the cultivation of military excellence. Ahriman, the exile who would not stop. Among the Chaos Space Marines of the 41st millennium, Ahriman occupies a unique position. He is the most active seeker of the Long War's non-military objectives. He is not trying to destroy the Imperium specifically. He is trying to find the knowledge that will undo what he created. The Rubric of Ahriman, the spell he cast at Magnus's direction to save the Thousand Sons, non-psychic warriors from the flesh change mutation. The spell that turned them to dust in their armor, preserving their consciousness as whispers inside empty shells, creating the Rubric Marines that are among the most recognizable units in the Chaos Space Marines range. He has spent 10,000 years trying to find a way to undo this, not because he doubts that he tried to do the right thing. He remains convinced that the Rubric was the best available option given what he knew, but because the specific outcome, his brothers preserved in amber, animated husks that follow the commands of psychers, rather than living with the specific quality of life that made them worth saving, is not the outcome he was trying to achieve. The Black Library, he has attempted to enter it multiple times. Ahriman's main goal, throughout the 41st millennium, is to gain access to the vast repository of knowledge known as the Black Library, which is hidden somewhere in the Elder Webway. He believes it contains what he needs. The Elder believe that a sorcerer of Tzeentch, accessing the most comprehensive repository of arcane knowledge in existence, would be catastrophic. They are probably right. He has gotten close. He has been expelled. He has tried other routes. He has encountered the Blood Raven's librarian Ramar, and seen in him the specific echo of what Thousand Sons had been, and offered the possibility that the two lineages were not as separate as the Blood Ravens believed. He has not stopped. The man who cast the Rubric has spent 10,000 years being the most brilliant and most frustrated figure in the Chaos Space Marines, carrying the specific weight of having done something irreversible in an attempt to do something good. Fabius Bile, the science that has no end, the Clone Lord, the Primogenitor, the Corpse Master. Fabius Bile has accumulated titles across 10,000 years that reflect what he has become. The most accomplished biological engineer in a galaxy that contains the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Necrons, the Tyranids, and every other species that has ever developed biological manipulation into an art. He began as the chief apothecary of the Emperor's children, the man responsible for their gene seed, their biological maintenance, their medical care. He ends, 10,000 years later, as something that has moved entirely beyond any of those original frames of reference. He creates new Space Marines, not through the proper channels of gene seed implantation and decades of training, through his own techniques from the slave populations of worlds, the Chaos Forces raid, producing what he calls his new men. These are not loyal to the Emperor or to the Chaos Gods. They are loyal to Bile, in the specific way that things he has made from scratch tend to be. He has cloned Primarchs. He has created warriors that surpass ordinary Space Marines in specific capabilities while lacking others. He has accumulated biological knowledge that the Adeptus Mechanicus would consider heresy of the most extreme kind, and that he considers simply the natural product of a career devoted to understanding and improving the human form. He does not serve chaos in the devout sense. He serves science, or what he has made science into after 10,000 years of having no ethical constraints and infinite subjects. He sells his services to whoever can pay in the specific currencies he finds valuable. Gene seed, specimens, the access that power and influence provide. He is, in the specific sense of someone who started with a skill and applied it for 10,000 years without stopping, the most advanced practitioner of his original vocation who has ever existed. The Red Corsairs. Not all Chaos Space Marines come from the original 9 Traitor Legions. The galaxy is full of Space Marine chapters that fell to chaos after the Heresy. Some through corruption, some through circumstance, some through the specific decisions of leaders whose personal choices reshaped their organization's relationship to the Imperium. Huron Blackheart and the Red Corsairs are the most prominent example. Luft Huron was the chapter master of the Astral Claws, the leader of the Badab War, a conflict where a Space Marine chapter fought against the Imperium rather than with it, where the specific institutional independence that Space Marine chapters are given expressed itself in a form that the High Lords of Terror found unacceptable. Huron survived the Badab War's conclusion barely. His body was rebuilt with bionics. His chapter was destroyed. He led the survivors into the Eye of Terror and renamed both himself and them, Huron Blackheart, the Red Corsairs, the Maelstrom Warband, a Chaos Space Marine force built from the ruins of something that had been loyal until the specific conflict that broke the loyalty. Abaddon gifted one of the 2 Blackstone fortresses from the Gothic War to Huron Blackheart, earning the Red Corsairs' participation in the 13th Black Crusade. This is the specific economy of the Long War. Weapons of extraordinary power exchanged for alliance because the Traitor Legions alone cannot achieve what coalitions can achieve. The Red Corsairs raid extensively throughout the galaxy, from the Maelstrom, another significant warp intrusion in the Eastern Galaxy. They conduct operations across Imperial space, not as expressions of 10,000-year ideology, as pirates, as mercenaries, as a force that fights for survival and advantage rather than for the completion of any grand design. They are what many Chaos Space Marines eventually become, people who have moved past whatever brought them to this point and are simply operating in the galaxy that the Long War has created. The Chaos Space Marine as an individual. Within the confines of the hellish zone of the galaxy known as the Eye of Terror, the banished Chaos Space Marines, along with their exiled allies and slaves, have created their own Imperium of Chaos. Technically, the Chaos Space Marine Legions are the only Space Marine Legions still in existence, the Loyalist Legions having been reformed into self-contained chapters after the Heresy. What this means for the individual warrior. 10,000 years of fighting in an environment that is itself hostile, for causes that range from the specific personal grievance to the abstract ideological, in service of gods who sustain those who please them and consume those who don't. The Chaos Space Marine who survives is not simply capable. They are the product of the specific selection pressure that the Long War has applied to everyone who entered it. The ones who are alive now are alive because every version of what could have killed them has tried and failed. They are not simply powerful. They have been tested in ways that make power a minimum requirement rather than a defining characteristic. They remember. This is the specific quality that distinguishes them from every other enemy the Imperium faces. The Tyranids have no history. The Necrons have history, but no emotional relationship to it. The Orcs have no interest in history. The Chaos Space Marines have specific, personal memories of what the Imperium was before the heresy and what it became after. They fought against it when it was at its greatest. They have watched it decay for 10,000 years into the theocratic stagnation that its founders were trying to prevent. They are right that things went wrong. This is one of the Long War's most disturbing qualities. The enemies of the Imperium who understand exactly what the Imperium is are not wrong about what they understand. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the Long War continues. We have followed the Chaos Space Marines from before the heresy, from who they were as the legions of the Great Crusade, through the Siege of Terror, and the Great Scouring, and the Eye of Terror, and 10,000 years of Black Crusades, and the specific individual stories of warriors who have been fighting longer than most human civilizations have existed. This is the question the series ends with. What is the Long War really? Not as a military campaign, not as a religious crusade, as a thing that persists across 10 millennia and cannot be resolved by any sequence of victories or defeats. The war that cannot be won by either side. The Imperium cannot destroy the Chaos Space Marines. The Eye of Terror is not a location that can be besieged and reduced. The forces inside it are sustained by the Chaos Gods themselves, not simply by military supply lines or population bases. An Imperium that somehow found the capability to mount a successful military expedition into the Eye of Terror would be fighting in an environment where physical law is unreliable, where the enemy has been operating for 10,000 years, where demon hosts can be summoned indefinitely against any force that enters. The Chaos Space Marines cannot destroy the Imperium. 12 Black Crusades demonstrated the limits of what even the most sustained and patient military campaign against the Imperium can achieve. The 13th came closest. Cadia fell, the Great Rift formed, the Imperium was split, and still the Imperium survived. Guilliman returned, the Indomitus Crusade deployed, the Primaris Space Marines reinforced the devastated sectors. The Imperium, despite everything the Long War had done to it across 9 millennia, retained the specific stubborn capacity to continue that has defined it since its founding. This is not simply a military stalemate. It is a structural feature of the setting's nature, an eternal conflict that neither side can fully resolve, sustained by forces whose interests are served by its continuation. What the Chaos Gods actually want. The Chaos Gods do not want to win the Long War. This is the specific insight that makes the Long War different from a conventional military conflict. The patrons of one side are not interested in the conflict's resolution. The Chaos Gods feed on mortal emotion, fear, anger, despair, grief, the specific psychic weight that human beings in terrible circumstances generate. All of this flows into the warp and sustains the ruinous powers. A galaxy at peace, where the Imperium is stable and its population is not in constant existential crisis, would not feed the Chaos Gods as effectively as the current situation. The Long War is the best thing that has ever happened to the Chaos Gods. A galaxy-spanning war between humanity and the forces of chaos, with a warp storm dividing the galaxy in half, with Nids approaching from the outer dark and Necrons waking in their tombs and Orcs spreading wherever they land. This is the Chaos Gods' ideal environment. Not a state of affairs to be improved, a state of affairs to be maintained. What does this mean for the Chaos Space Marines who serve them? That the specific patrons they have given themselves to are not interested in the victory those warriors are fighting for. Khorne wants blood and skulls. He wants the blood to keep being shed, not to be shed in one final victorious moment and then stop. Thirteenth wants change and complexity and the specific pleasure of plans within plans. A simple victory would end the complexity. Nurgle wants the decay to continue, not to conclude. Slaanesh wants the sensation, not the satisfaction. The warrior who fights for chaos is fighting a war that his gods have every interest in prolonging. He is, in the most specific sense, the perpetual motion machine of his own patron's power source. Abaddon knows this. He has known it since before the first Black Crusade. His crimson path is the specific attempt of a mortal mind to achieve actual victory in a war that his divine patrons would prefer not to conclude. Whether a mortal can outmaneuver the specific interests of four gods who have been sustaining the long war for 10,000 years is the question that the setting uses to keep the narrative open rather than resolved. What they remember. There is a specific quality to the grief that the Chaos Space Marines carry that distinguishes them from every other enemy the Imperium faces. The Tyranids have no memory. The Necrons have memory, but its relationship to grief is different. 60 million years of nothing tends to produce a different relationship to loss than 10,000 years of active war. The Orcs live entirely in the present. The Chaos Space Marines remember the Great Crusade, not simply as information, as an emotional reality that 10,000 years has not resolved. They were there. Some of them were there. The oldest among them fought in the Horus Heresy. They watched the Emperor build something extraordinary over 2 centuries of unified expansion. They watched it destroyed in 9 years. They participated in the destruction. What the Great Crusade represented: a human civilization spanning the galaxy, rational rather than theocratic, organized around the Emperor's genuine vision rather than the Inquisition's fear management, is gone. It is gone specifically because of choices that the Chaos Space Marines made. And 10,000 years of the Long War have not produced anything that resembles it. The Eye of Terror is not the Great Crusade's replacement. It is the specific absence of what the Great Crusade was. The Chaos Space Marines are the people who destroyed the best thing humanity ever built and have been living in the ruin of that destruction ever since. The Chaos Gods sustain them. The Long War continues, but nowhere in the Eye of Terror in 10,000 years has anything been built that resembles what they tore down. The Renegade chapters and what they show. After the Horus Heresy, some Space Marine chapters fall to chaos in every subsequent century. Not many. The Codex Astartes and the Inquisition and the chapter culture that forms around loyalty to the Emperor are effective barriers, but the specific pressures of a Space Marine chapter's existence, the potential for isolation, for corruption at the leadership level, for the specific crisis of faith that the 41st millennium's darkness produces in beings who were designed to fight in the Emperor's name, mean that the Chaos Space Marines are not simply the 9 Traitor Legions. They are a category that keeps receiving additions. The Red Corsairs, the Crimson Slaughter, the Purge, the Violators, each one a chapter that was loyal until it was not, that served the Imperium until something broke the service, that then entered the Long War as a new voice with a new grievance and a new reason for the war to continue. What these chapters show, the conditions that produced the original heresy, are not historical. They are present. The specific combination of isolation and pressure and the darkness of the 41st millennium and the absence of the Emperor's direct presence. These are conditions that existed during the heresy and that still exist now. The heresy did not end the conditions that caused it. It simply killed the specific individuals who were the first to crack under them. The Long War recruits from the Imperium's own failures. Every chapter that falls represents a failure of the specific civilization that the Chaos Space Marines were trying to destroy, which means the Chaos Space Marines' own long war is generating the evidence that the Imperium is worth destroying. What the age of the Dark Imperium looks like. From the eye. The Great Rift has changed the Long War's strategic environment in specific ways. The Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Imperium cut off from the Astronomicon, is a region where Imperial governance is failing in ways that it had not failed before. Worlds are falling. Governors are losing contact with Terra. The specific infrastructure of the Imperium that depends on reliable warp travel and communication is breaking down in regions where reliable warp travel is no longer possible. This creates opportunities that the first 12 Black Crusades had not fully existed in the same form. Chaos Space Marine warbands operating in the Imperium Nihilus do not face the same coordinated response that operations near the Cadian Gate had always faced. The supply lines of Imperial response have been disrupted. The reinforcements that had historically arrived to repel Black Crusades are not available across the Great Rift in the way they had been. Abaddon has not marched on Terra. The march on Terra that the Crimson Path was building toward is not yet happening in the setting's current timeline. But the specific conditions, the Imperium split in half, the Eye of Terror expanded, the pylons destroyed, that the march requires are now present. What has prevented the march is Guilliman's return and the Indomitus Crusade's deployment of the Primaris Space Marines, an injection of new military capability at exactly the moment the Imperium needed it most. The Long War in the age of the Dark Imperium is the Long War at its highest stakes since the Horus Heresy. Both sides have things they did not have before. The Imperium has Guilliman and the Primaris. Chaos has the Great Rift and the Expanded Eye. The specific balance of these new factors is what the setting's current narrative is organized around. Why the Long War cannot end. The Long War cannot end because ending it would require one of the following outcomes, and none of them are achievable. The Chaos Gods would have to lose interest in sustaining it. This will not happen as long as mortal beings exist and generate the emotions that feed the ruinous powers. The Imperium would have to be completely destroyed. 10,000 years of Black Crusades and every other threat the galaxy contains have not accomplished this. The specific resilience of a civilization of 1,000,000 worlds, organized around a willingness to sacrifice anything rather than cease to exist, is not a quality that military pressure can simply overcome. The Chaos Space Marines themselves would have to find something that answered what the Long War was built around. The grief of what was lost, the specific wound that the heresy inflicted on beings who had spent 2 centuries helping to build something and then participated in its destruction. Something that resolved this rather than sustained it. Nothing in the Eye of Terror offers this resolution. The Chaos Gods do not offer it. They feed on the grief rather than healing it. The Long War continues it. It is organized around the grief rather than addressing it. The Chaos Space Marines are warriors who cannot win and cannot stop, not because they lack the capability, but because the war they are fighting is not the war they are actually in. The actual war between who they were and what they became, between the civilization they helped build and the civilization they helped destroy, is not a war that can be won with weapons. One final image. Somewhere in the Eye of Terror, in the specific twilight of a demon world, where the boundary between real space and the immaterium is so thin that both are present simultaneously, a space marine in black armor stands before a wall. The wall is carved with names. Every name is the name of someone who died in the siege of Terror. not from the traitor side, but from the loyalist side, carved here in the specific way that people sometimes keep the records of what they destroyed. The names of the people who were killed in the war that the warrior in black armor participated in. The specific accounting of the cost. He is not here often. He spends most of his time fighting. The long war continues, and his part in it does not stop. But sometimes he comes here, in the specific way that very old beings sometimes return to the records of things they cannot change. He runs his hand along the names. The talon of Horus makes this difficult. The ancient weapon he carries, the one that killed Sanguinius's captain at Macon, makes everything that requires gentleness difficult. He manages. Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos, the most feared enemy the Imperium has faced in 10,000 years, stands in a place he keeps to himself and remembers what it cost. The Great Crusade, what it was, what he was in it, what he helped make and then helped unmake. The Chaos gods sustain him. The long war continues. The Great Rift is open, and the Crimson Path is closer to completion than it has ever been. And the Wall of Names is the specific thing that 10,000 years of victory and massacre and the accumulated power of 4 divine patrons has not given him any way to address. The Long War has never been about terror. It has always been about this wall. This has been the entire Chaos Space Marines timeline. From the Great Crusade and what the Legions were, through the heresy and the betrayal and the Long War and 13 Black Crusades and the specific individual lives that 10,000 years of fighting have produced, told slowly, over 8 nights, for the long dark between sleep and waking. The eye of terror burns. The great rift divides the sky. The warriors in the black and the warriors in the black fight on. They always have. Good night.